Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartia. Today we have with us David A. Wheeler, Director of Open Source Supply Chain Security at the Linux Foundation. David, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much.
This is a topic which is really close to my heart, open source supply chain and security. Because when you look at open source, what happens is it doesn't matter whether you're consuming using open source or you are repackaging as a vendor. There are so many components that goes in, and if you do not have a kind of inventory of what is, it's just like assembly line of a car or recipe of a dish. You need to know everything if you want to be safe or healthy. So can you, let's start with explain the importance of understanding the open source supply chain.
Let's start with the basics quickly. What's open source software? It's software that anybody can view, modify, redistribute without requiring things like royalty payments and so on. And decades ago, I mean, it's been around for many, many decades. So you can point to this back to the 1950s, but really started gaining steam in the 1990s. And depending on the surveys you view now, somewhere around 70% or more of code bases, as soon as you open them up, are in fact open source components. Open source software is everywhere. So you mentioned, large companies, sell support and so on. But it's just, as soon as you open up the hood of just about anything, there's all sorts of open source inside. Now, of course, once it's inside, and you've got all those components, that means that since most of your functionality is in fact open source software, whether or not it works, whether or not there's an issue, whether or not there's a security vulnerability is really critical. And of course, make sure you get the correct components, not something that you thought was the component you wanted, but in fact is someone maliciously trying to fool you. So it's very, very important to make sure that you're getting the correct components, keep them up to date. And indeed, we want to make sure that those open source software components that people use are secure.
Linux Foundation runs many initiatives. Their CII is one, SPDX is one. Can you talk about, as the director of open source supply chain security, how do you work internally, not only with this internal project, but also the larger open source community?
The list of open source software projects are really important. They're managed by the Linux kernel, Linux Foundation is pretty large. Obviously, just from the name, you can figure out that the Linux kernel is one. You've mentioned Kubernetes, Prometheus. I mean, the list is huge, absolutely huge. So what's my role? First of all, let me clarify, although hopefully it's pretty obvious anyway. I personally cannot just by myself suddenly make all open source software secure, or really even all Linux Foundation projects secure all by myself. That's not reasonable. What I can do instead is work with different foundations, different projects to help them identify what things they need to be doing. We can identify projects that need to be started or really ramped up faster to improve the security overall. So I view my job fundamentally is helping others do what they already want to do, but enabling them. Now, you mentioned the CII, that's the Core Infrastructure Initiative. Linux Foundation ran that for a number of years. For various reasons, we've actually decided to shut that down and replace that with something else called the Open Source the Open Source Security Foundation, OpenSSF. So if you go to openssf.org, you'll see that. That's essentially the successor to the CII. Some of the projects that were done under the CII, such as the CII Best Practices Badge, which is set of criteria encouraging developing open source software securely. If you meet those criteria, you get a badge. That's now been rolled into the OpenSSF. And we have a variety of projects. So that's one. In fact, I lead that particular project, the Best Practices Badge project, where here's criteria, you meet those criteria, you get a badge, and they require things that really open source projects should be doing, not always doing. Do you have tests, automated tests? Do you use tools to look for problems? It's the kinds of things when you look at them. Most people, when they look at our criteria, they go, yeah, that's right. Those are reasonable things to require, but not everyone necessarily does them. I'll reveal to you probably the most missed one is not telling people how to report vulnerabilities. Because if there's a vulnerability Now's the wrong time to try to figure out how do I report a vulnerability. No, we need to tell people and get it fixed, not try to figure out how to get those reported. Lots of other things. The OpenSSF is probably the one that focuses specifically on security. So a number of things that it does. When you start talking about open source security, it does a number of things. For example, OpenSSF released a freely available class. How do I, not class, a course. How do I develop secure software? Here, freely available. It's a course on edX. Go get started. And if you go to openssf.org and click on, I think it's under education, you can get the links to take those. It's actually a trio of 3 courses. Lots and lots of other things are going on that basically are trying to. It's not that open source is all insecure. That's not true at all. In fact, a lot of open source is really secure, but we want to raise the bar because the attackers are raising the bar.
Open source is just like any other software. Software will have bugs, and those bugs become vulnerability. And at the same time, the bad actors, they keep looking for those holes. You have, as a security person, you have to be right 100% of time. They have to be right only once, and that one opportunity is that they exploit. So yes, open source make it more secure because there are more eyeballs. They're looking at the code, but by design, the very nature of its being software, security is going to be a challenge there. Now let's just quickly switch the topics. Security used to be an afterthought, but because of cloud native, where things are moving faster, security has kind of moved into the pipeline of developers. We talk about DevSecOps, and now we are also seeing a lot of initiatives all the way from the federal government as well. Recently, the White House, they released an executive order that is basically aimed, the goal is more or less about cybersecurity. Though it is still something in works. We can debate about the language that is being used there, but concerns are genuine looking at all the ransomware attacks that are happening. We are in the East Coast. We had a big crisis there. So let's first try to understand from your perspective, how do you look at this executive order? What is it all about?
Oh, boy. You've already mentioned one of the many issues. The U.S. government, of course, U.S. East Coast suddenly lost half of its fuel supply due to an attack, a ransomware attack. It turns out. Just before that, there was an attack on SolarWinds, a particular product called Orion, within its build system. That was actually part of a larger attack. What was intriguing about that was that somebody, modified the software after it was the source code, the things that the developers developed, but before it was released. So got into the process of converting the stuff that the developers write into the software that's signed and shipped. And I think people have said, well, hey, it looks like the insurance companies will pay like $90 billion. That's not really the issue. From the U.S. government's point of view, having all that information revealed, the numbers are hard to come by, but one group was estimating $100 billion. And whether or not it's $100 billion to fix, it's not really the point. The point is, this is going to cost a massive amount of time. And those kinds of numbers, even the government, U.S. government cares about, especially since that's just one of many, many attacks. It's not the sole attack at all. So I think that's the background. It's not just the pipeline. It's over and over and over again. So I thought you might ask something like this. So I think, frankly, the simplest way to understand this cybersecurity executive order is it tries to be comprehensive. They're trying to deal with the problem that probably should have been dealt with 20, 30 years ago. And people have been working a little bit, but not to the same extent that's really necessary. So I'll just read you its headings. I think that's actually a simple way to understand it. Threat information sharing, modernizing government cybersecurity, enhancing software supply chain security, a review board, standardizing response, improving detection, improving remediation, and even talking about national security systems, which sometimes get exempted from some of the things that the rest of the federal government does, but not this time. So they're trying to be more comprehensive and really address the problem, as opposed to, for example, if you look at a lot of the existing cybersecurity related things that the government does. Oftentimes it's basically take in random software from the commercial sector, including open source software, hope it's secure, and we'll configure it until it's secure. And that's not really adequate. You need it secure in the first place. And so I think fundamentally, and really you need to have this bigger picture. So that's at least what they're trying to do.
Recently, the Brazilian, meat packing, company that was also under attack. Now, what is going to happen is that as our infrastructure is becoming more and more sophisticated, it is becoming more and more reliant on, or you can call it software data driven, and most of these software components are open source, as you earlier mentioned. The challenge is that we will not need an actual warfare. Just shutting down the whole pipeline, after that taking the whole grid out and suddenly disrupt the whole supply chain will bring a country to its knees. There will be chaos, there will be riots just for food and water. So you do not need conventional warfare in modern world. So this is going to be a critical piece. And I was talking to law enforcement a few days ago just to understand that. And they were like, it's kind of, we should have been ahead of, we are so behind in preparedness. So what I also want to understand from you is the severity or the risk that is there by not taking any action to protect our infrastructure. I mean, if you look at Linux Foundation, you folks are doing a lot of work, but a lot of things have to come down from the federal government level, not just federal government for the US, but globally.
You mentioned earlier the word risk. So far, the way too many people have just said, well, that's somebody else's problem and somebody else's problem. And of course, the problem is that it's all collectively going to be our problem. You mentioned, food, energy, shelter. These are things that are rather important. And software is the primary way that we automate. Fundamentally, in order to have a modern society, you automate the heck out of stuff. But that means that we're depending on software that, frankly, just has not gotten the kind of review and analysis necessarily. Open source software has the great advantage that you can do the analysis, but some of it is analyzed and a whole lot's done, some less so. In many cases, one of the biggest challenges today is that when a problem is found in a component, be it open source or anything else, anything that's reused, it's often not updated. This is a perennial problem. If you look at the executive order, they spent a lot of time talking about software bill of materials. There was a push years ago within the Congress trying to get a software bill of materials, basically ingredients list, published out. And a lot of organizations really pushed hard. I don't want anybody to know what's in what you're getting, even though, wait a minute, I'm the customer. If I'm the customer, that is the list of my risks. Why are you withholding the risks that are here? And what that has led to is software systems that contain really old versions with lots of known vulnerabilities and very easy to exploit. And there is no transparency and therefore no accountability. So although that's not the only thing in the executive order, that's a key part of it, is they're basically saying, no, we're not going to do this anymore. If we're going to use the software, we want to know what's in it. And I think what we're going to find is that some projects and some systems are doing very well, and some have a lot of work to do so that they update to current versions. This whole I'll update 10 years from now is not a viable model when attackers may attack within a day of a vulnerability being found. It doesn't make these timescales just don't make any sense.
As you earlier mentioned, that most of the code that is running today is open source, and open source communities are really, really active or proactive, especially if you look at Linux kernel. They are like one of the best out there, and other communities, they are also very good. Can you talk about what initiative Linux Foundation is doing for its community? Because Linux Foundation is a foundation of foundations, right? It's an umbrella which has a lot of foundations. So talk about that, all these Linux Foundation projects, how ready they are to support this executive order.
As you mentioned, Linux Foundation is a foundation of foundations, and within those foundations, you've got lots and lots of projects. So no matter what I say, it's going to be a broad brush. But let me try to answer your question anyway. So I mentioned earlier, I actually wrote an article which walked through the executive order and tried to identify some of the many, many projects that the Linux Foundation does that relate to the executive order. So, for example, we mentioned SBOMs earlier. One of the key projects within the Linux Foundation is something called SPDX, which is a standard for listing software bill of materials that can apply to any ecosystem. And that, again, that doesn't, just having a bill of materials doesn't fix everything, but at least you know what you're bringing in, and that's the first step to asking, risk. What's the risk level? Wait a minute, you got a component in there that has 1,000 known vulnerabilities. You should update, or you should do something, or maybe I need to change how I use that software to reduce my risks. You mentioned the Linux kernel. Linux kernel actually does quite a number of things, specifically to counter vulnerabilities. They're very proactive. I mentioned CI best practices. That's probably one of the broader where we try to identify criteria so people, hey, projects, do these things, you're more likely to produce secure software. And when you make a mistake, you'll be able to respond much more quickly. OpenSSF does a number of things. It's a little early, but I should note the metrics.openssf.org site, where the goal is to, hey, I'm interested in this particular open source component. Give me some information about it. Tell me some metrics. And you can just go in, and you either type in a name, or it has an API, so you can do automated queries and get some information about some projects so that you can do some of that risk analysis. We're working with lots and lots of different projects to improve the security. As I mentioned, I can't possibly do it all, but I have interacted with some of the projects which are kind of especially critical. So, for example, for Linux Foundation's public health, we're worried about exposure notification. We did audits, security audits of it, found some problems, fixed them. They weren't crisis, but you want to eliminate as many problems as you can. Work with LF Energy. Obviously, energy is very, very important. And just in general, you mentioned earlier the old DevSecOps. It does not instantaneously solve all things, but clearly, if you care about security and you're developing software, you should have what's called a CI pipeline. Every time you make changes, or at least once a day, you're running tests, and then including in that a number of tools. Will the tools find all problems? No. Is every tool report gospel and always correct? No. Does it help? Yes. And the goal there is to slowly find over time the issues, the problems. And you mentioned, bugs can become vulnerabilities. It's true. But there are other efforts to reduce the likelihood of defects becoming vulnerabilities, because we all make mistakes. And so there's a number of hardening initiatives so that even if you make a mistake, it's less likely to become a vulnerability. Again, not perfect. You can't guarantee that no mistakes can ever become vulnerabilities, but you can, through a combination of these mechanisms, really bring down the number of vulnerabilities. And you already mentioned earlier, peer review. The more eyeballs, the better. And the other part is the better the brains behind their eyeballs understand security, which is why we have pressed on education so much. It doesn't matter if the reviewer is reviewing something, but they don't understand security. And so we've been really pushing, getting people to learn more about security. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I know we've got a lot of folks and more to come taking those free courses. And I think that in the long term is going to need to be key. And by the way, that's probably the missing element in this executive order. They really don't talk about education and training. And that, I think, is the missing piece in the executive order. Most software developers, they've never been told how to develop secure software. We're getting exactly what we train them to do.
If you look at this executive order, it cannot be, it's not something that can be relayed and is done. It also needs a lot of support from the tech industry and especially Linux Foundation, which is sitting at the center, because if you look at the Linux Foundation, you mentioned so many projects. You mentioned Hyperledger. You mentioned the Life Health Initiative, and Brian Bellendorf is heading it. And he used to be, I think, a technocrat or techno diplomat. He used to work with the Obama team as well. So I think I will talk to him also just to understand how he will be getting involved there. But the point is that they cannot do it alone. They need a lot of help from the community. So what are the ways that you think Linux Foundation communities can help in the execution of this executive orders? No pun intended.
Right. And you know what? I think the executive order is an opportunity, but we need to acknowledge that this is not a U.S. specific problem. Countries around the world all depend on automation to more or lesser degree, but we all depend on software. And so while it's appropriate for us to talk about the U.S. executive order, I think a lot of organizations have said, this is important, whether or not there was an executive order. But getting back to your original question about what can do, I will say I see at least some positive signs. I actually participated in a panel at NIST, US NIST, where they were asking some specific questions, trying to help implement this. I think that's and they've said the right phrases, public private partnerships. In the U.S., that's a common phrase, public-private partnerships. The problem is oftentimes public-private partnerships are long on the public and very short on the private. And for example, I mentioned, I did participate, but relatively few people. It depends on how you count, but a lot of the folks who were speaking weren't speaking from a long depth of the open source community, even though the majority of the software is open source. And I think that's a little bit of a concern. I think, I have talked with NIST, and I'm hoping that, they'll increase. I think they're making the right first steps, but they need to keep going because on the one hand, there is a huge appetite in the private sector to improve security, not just for the US government, but for other governments and indeed for themselves. But it truly needs to be a partnership for that to work. It's really, really easy for the government to create requirements that are either pointless, they won't do anything useful, or impossible. And neither of those serve anyone, actually. So I think what we really need to do is take that phrase and make it a reality, acknowledging that it's hard, but that's, I think, really the big picture. And now we can talk about the specifics. I think that the U.S. government, it would be appropriate for it to invest in some areas. I think there are areas where there's a need for specifications and so on. But a whole lot of it's just execute what's already known, but not necessarily executed.
Can you also go a bit more in details about the importance or the state of course, encryption? You have touched upon all these points, but I just want to encapsulate in just one answer, which is encryption, data confidentiality, of course, software bill of materials, vulnerability, disclosure, supply chain integrity, communication. Talk about, there's so much, that it will, but if you can just summarize quickly the importance of all these things to ensure that your stack is secure, to make sure that this executive order will be effective.
All the things that you listed are important parts. No one thing turns insecure systems into magically secure systems. You really have to look at the bigger picture and you have to combine different approaches. The good news is that, in fact, you can do all this. None of this is magic. Most of the basics were actually known in the 1970s, not by developers because nobody teaches them, but the information is widely is known. I am happy to see, for example, a reemphasis on encryption. There's historically been some, hey, we want encryption, but only for some people. And I think they're now just focusing on, wait a minute, we need security at rest. We need encryption at rest. We need encryption in motion. And okay, that's good. Getting back to the right knitting instead of trying to make it so that only some people can encrypt. So I think that's promising. You had such a long list. I think Interestingly enough, one of the longer term things that they've mentioned is having a review board looking at what went wrong and what can be done, basically copying what the airlines already do. I don't think that's going to have a short-term benefit. That could have a very serious long-term benefit because right now we aren't, in general, learning from past mistakes. That's really what education should be about, in many ways, is learning from those who've gone before and taking advantage of what people have learned. And so I'm again to emphasize education, and really I would say that's all part of it, is trying to learn from past problems. Because right now, oh look, it's another ransomware attack. Give me a week, there'll be another ransomware attack. Actually, it wouldn't even have to be that long. But we're not really learning. We're just, the mistakes just keep happening. So that's what I'm hoping to see longer term. And, I think that would be great for everybody.
David, thank you so much for taking time out today and talk about a really complicated topic, but you kind of made it simple also to understand for a lot of folks, and also that it's there's no turnkey that hey, you turn the button on and everything is secure. It's a lot of effort, it's a lot of technology, a lot of socials, a lot of interaction. But thanks for the effort that you folks are doing at the Linux Foundation. And I would love to have you back on the show to talk more about open source security and supply chain. So thank you today.
Thank you very much. I'd love to chat again.